Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. W.F. Strong.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Good Books Radio. I'm your host today, Dr. W.F. Strong. And as always, I want to thank our underwriter, audiobooks.com, for making this show possible. If you don't catch the entire show today, you can always get it on our YouTube channel, and that is at Good Books Radio on YouTube, of course. And you can also check out our Facebook page, Good Books Radio on Facebook. So that is always available to you in a kind of podcast form where you can listen to these programs and you can go back and get the older ones that are archived. Once in a while, I get a book in the mail that I'm not sure about. I receive probably 3 or 4 books every day at least from various publishers, from Penguin, Simon & Schuster, and many of the frontline publishers in America, to consider their books for interviews. And I go through these choices, and it's quite exciting. It's kind of like a kid on Christmas because I always get new books. And for a bibliophile, that is a magical experience every day. But this one came in the mail, and it was the description for it. The book was called A Really Good Day, but the subtitle for it was about microdosing. And I thought, well, that's an interesting title, but it said, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, Marriage, and My Life. Of course, I didn't know what microdosing was until I looked further into it, and then I discovered that they were talking about LSD. So again, I wasn't sure. I said, this has got to be illegal, so I'm not sure that I want to dig into this very much. But on the other hand, it's very intriguing. Certainly I'd heard about LSD taken by Steve Jobs and by Lewis Carroll and by Huxley and many others who have kind of sworn by it as a creative force in their lives. In fact, many of them thought they wouldn't have been as successful had they not done this. But they weren't microdosing. They were taking full, large, creative doses of the substance, and they said it enlightened them, it opened their minds where they could think new thoughts and create new ideas. And so I thought, well, microdosing, that's interesting. So I got the book and I looked into it, and I began to understand that the author wasn't talking about going on a trip, listening to Black Sabbath and seeing God. It was, moreover, a controlled response to depression. And instead of taking what would be, let's say, a full dose, let's say that would be 100% of something, she was taking 10% of that full dose. I don't know what it is in milligrams or whatever, but let's just say it's 10% of what the regular big dose that a Lewis Carroll might have taken before he wrote his famous works. And so I said, okay, I will read this book. I'll interview the author, and she's standing by today. We're going to talk to her in just a moment. But the reviews for this book have been quite good. We have some very good reviews from Amazon.com where they handily collate all the publishers' commentaries, professional critics, etc. Oprah's magazine says that A Really Good Day delivers a mind-bending read. It's documented with wit and humility, and O Magazine says this is one of the 10 titles that you should pick up now. Washington Post says that this is an intriguing and thorough look at the therapeutic possibilities of an illegal drug. Lisa Shea of Elle Magazine says that it is wildly brilliant, it is radically candid, it is a rigorous day book of a life-changing last resort journey. This is a best-selling book under psychotherapeutics. It is also a best-selling book in bipolar books. And then we have this critique from Donna Seaman on Booklist that says, smart, outspoken, provoking, and funny. It is poignant. It is sometimes hilarious. Waldman calls for renewed research and drug law reform in this informative, candid, altogether irresistible quest. So let's go talk to her now. Okay, so listen, I was reading about you getting in trouble on Oprah for loving your husband more than your children.
Yeah, that was a while ago. I just got a new puppy, and I was lying in bed cuddling with her, and I said to my husband, hey, listen, I might go back on Oprah to tell her I love my dog more than my husband.
So you got a lot of flack for that, huh?
I did. Yes, I did.
And what was the kind of gist of the most common response?
Well, there were a lot of people. I was responding to what I saw was this kind of aggressive, hysterical parenting, where women were prioritizing their children over everything else in their lives, including their spouses. And I was saying that in my family, that my marriage, the couple that is the center of our family, that started this to begin with, that's where my husband and I prioritize our love for each other. And I said, if a good mother is a mother who loves her children more than anyone else in the world, well, then I'm a bad mother because I love my husband more than my children. And you would have thought I had said that I wanted to throw my children beneath the wheels of a truck. But it's interesting because I heard from a lot of priests and pastors and rabbis who said, amen, because the Bible doesn't say, cleave unto your toddler. The Bible says cleave unto your spouse. And it turned out that even without knowing Scripture, all I was doing was quoting it.
Well, I think the theological position is that if you do that, if you make that the focus, everything else will be okay.
I think that's true. I mean, that's the idea. I wasn't saying I don't care about my kids.
Sure.
I love my kids like crazy. I mean, my kids would probably say that I'm like a little bit too attentive. But what I was saying is that, to live in a family, you have to prioritize the relationship at the heart of it, whoever you're married to or whoever you're with. And it is far more damaging to children for their parents to split apart or to live in misery than it is for their parents to love each other and focus on each other.
And what are these detractors going to say when they find out you're experimenting with LSD?
I thought about that. I thought, oh, my goodness, they were mad at me then. Their heads are going to explode now. But let me tell you what was going on. I have a mood disorder. It was very well controlled. I took my medicine. I'm not one of those people who doesn't like to take her meds. I took my meds, but my meds stopped working, and I started to get depressed, and I started to get really depressed. And eventually I found myself suicidal.
Oh my.
I was doing things like Googling the effects of maternal suicide on children. And I was anhedonic. I had no ability to experience pleasure. And none of the medications were working. None of the therapies were working.
Were you taking things like tricyclics?
Yep, I was trying pretty much. The list of medications that I've tried takes up half a page in my book. And it's in paragraph form, not a list. I tried everything. And eventually I'd been reading and hearing about microdosing with LSD, and there's a lot of good research out there about how psychedelic drugs have been linked, first of all, to decreases in suicide. People who have used LSD are less likely to commit suicide than people who haven't. But also there's amazing research happening on psychedelic drugs alleviating depression and anxiety in people facing the fear of the end of their lives. They've been studying terminal patients. They give them a psychedelic drug called psilocybin, and it alleviates their fear and anxiety and makes it possible for them to have, frankly, a good death. And I thought, well, if that drug can make people have a good death, I'm too afraid to try a big dose. I've never tripped or anything like that. But maybe a small dose, a tiny dose, a microdose, maybe that can help me stop suffering so much. And in fact, that's just what happened. I did a 1-month experiment with tiny doses of LSD, 1/10 of a dose, 10 micrograms, taken every 3 days, and it catalyzed the end of my depression. It brought me up out of that dark place. It made me feel better. My kids, they didn't know that I was taking LSD. They just knew I was trying a new medication. They were so amazed at how much better I was. I mean, this is how crazy it was. At one point, my teenage daughter said to me, oh my God, I was, giggling and laughing at breakfast and trying to braid her hair. And usually for months and months and months, and as long as she could remember, I'd been sitting there glowering and grim and depressed. And she looked at me and said, "What is wrong with you? Are you on acid?" Out of the blue. And at that moment I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to have to tell them?
I guess you have now.
Yeah. Turns out when you publish a book, you got to tell the truth.
I liked your expression in the book where you said, I didn't take a trip. I didn't go on a trip. I went on an errand.
Yes, not an acid trip, more like an acid errand. Just a little tiny bit. I didn't experience any of those side effects that people talk about. I didn't have any visual hallucinations. If I slipped you, if I told you right now, hey, guess what, Bill? I just slipped a microdose into your coffee. You wouldn't even notice. What would happen is you would do everything that you do in your normal day. You might work a little more attentively. You might be a little more creative and productive. You might be a little nicer to be around. And at the end of the day, as you were brushing your teeth, you'd think back on your day and you'd say, that was a really good day. And then you'd wonder what was going on.
And hence the title of your book, right?
Hence the title of my book, exactly.
Now, isn't it true that, you're talking about therapeutic dosing, and
yes.
Isn't it true that there's a lot of examples, well, you have them in your book, of people who have been noted for being highly creative, who perhaps got those creative ideas from LSD?
Well, absolutely. Steve Jobs, who created Apple, Steve Jobs was very open in saying that LSD changed his life. He attributed much of his creative inspiration to an LSD trip he took. During the 60s, there was a lot of, between the 30s and the 60s when LSD was criminalized, there was a lot of research that was going on. And there was research in Silicon Valley by a man named James Fadiman and others on the connection between LSD and creativity. And in that study, Fadiman and his colleagues solicited engineers, biochemists, people who were around Stanford University doing interesting work in various fields, and they said to them, come do this LSD study and bring a problem you haven't been able to solve. Bring something that's driving you nuts. And I don't mean like a personal problem, I mean a work problem, an equation that you can't figure out the answer to, a design problem that has been tricky, something that you need help working on. And they dosed people with LSD, and not every time, but many times, those individuals solved the problem that they hadn't been able to solve. Because what LSD does is it causes different parts of your brain to communicate in ways they don't normally communicate. And that can lead to tremendous creative insight. It can increase neuroplasticity, the ability of our brains to change and grow. It's a really, it's a very powerful and very interesting drug. And the fact that we've criminalized it and made it so difficult to study has really hurt our potential.
Well, you point out in the book, and I think this is counterintuitive for what most people believe, is you cannot OD on LSD.
No, I thought you could OD on LSD. I thought once I started researching it, I'd read about thousands of cases of overdose. After all, you can overdose on Tylenol. Hundreds of people die every year taking Tylenol. It turns out that there's something called an LD50, which is a designation of the amount of a drug that you have to take to die. And there is no LD50 for LSD because there is no verified LSD fatality. Not one. There are two cases that were attributed to LSD overdose. One of them was clearly someone who died of exposure, and the other one is a very strange incident that people mostly doubt is real. But, the one verified case of an LSD overdose is the overdose of an elephant. Someone shot some lunatic shot an elephant full of a massive quantity of LSD, and the elephant had a heart attack and died. But that's never happened to a human. There was, it's really interesting once you start. Our mythology is so elaborate. The most thoroughly researched case is a group of people in San Francisco in the 60s thought they were doing lines of cocaine, but they were actually snorting pure LSD. They took about 11,000 times a typical dose.
I remember reading that.
Right?
How can you be so messed up that you make
I know.
that?
You got to be really stoned to make that decision. And bad things happened to them. One of them had to be intubated. They had they had internal bleeding. They ended up in comas. What was amazing was that within 12 days, they all left the hospital perfectly healthy. So this is not a drug that is dangerous in the way that we think it's dangerous.
Right. What you also point out in your book is, so your book has a wonderful education about our country's relationship or long relationship with drugs. And I didn't know that we got our first anti-drug laws in, was 1875?
Right, but the first anti-drug laws were really anti-Chinese immigrant laws. The criminalization of drugs in the United States has always been linked to the criminalization of different minority groups. So at the time that the first anti-drug laws were passed in California, these were laws about Chinese opium dens. At that time, the average user of opium was a middle-class white woman. They were taking laudanum, which is opium and alcohol mixed, and they were taking it all the time for all sorts of different ailments. And we had a huge opiate addiction rate back then because everybody was tippling from their laudanum. The surgeon who founded Johns Hopkins Hospital was a heroin addict who cured his heroin addiction. Well, he was a cocaine addict who cured his cocaine addiction by becoming a heroin addict. So, we use drugs all the time. You could right away to the Sears Roebuck catalog for your heroin syringe kit, which was a little kit in a metal box that came with a syringe and a needle and a little rubber band to tie off your arm and a little supply of heroin.
Wow.
You could get a shot of cocaine in your whiskey at the local bar. I mean, we used a lot of drugs back then.
And you point out in the book, too, that doctors encouraged mamas to give a little bit, a tincture of opium and other things to kids to relax them so they can sleep.
Is your baby crying? Is your baby colicky? Here's a little opium. It turns out you can knock that baby right out. I remember when I first discovered that I had a colicky baby, and there were definitely times when I thought, oh, would that I were back at the turn of the last century when I could just knock this baby out with a little opium and get a good night's sleep.
And you just had to rely on Benadryl. Yeah,
well, I didn't even do that. I just had to walk that baby around listening to her scream.
This book, I think, is wonderful in that you have kind of a Mary Roach type sense of humor, I think, and so that makes it all the more lovely and enjoyable because it's funny.
Oh, thank you. My husband said to me when he first read the manuscript, he said, "You're writing about such serious stuff. You're writing about, depression, about the war on drugs, about mass incarceration, about the history of psychedelics. But this is the funniest book you've ever written." And I think, a spoonful of sugar, or of LSD, it makes the medicine go down.
Well, I love the part where you were talking about your own surprise that you're microdosing because your kids think of you in your terms, what you said, they think of you as basic.
Yeah,
I love that
basic
description.
B. Let's not say that word online, but yeah, I'm like the lady in yoga pants standing in line for the skinny mocha latte. I am not the most likely person to be using psychedelic drugs.
Now, if you microdose, and I assume there's as you point out in the book, there is a kind of disconnected community who have found the secret that you have found. But do you keep doing it, or do you just come out of your depression and you're done?
Well, look, if this drug were legal, there is no doubt in my mind that I would be using it as an alternative to antidepressants. Because I think it is, I have made the decision for myself that it is safer and more effective. But I'm not willing to commit a crime. I'm not willing to risk incarceration. I don't want my children to have to visit me in jail. And Piper Kerman already wrote Orange is the New Black, so I wouldn't even get a sequel out of it. So once the worst of my depression was over, I stopped. I did a 1 month-long experiment, and then I stopped. Most people don't. Most people who microdose continue microdosing. I made the decision that I was going to go public and that I was going to become an advocate. And that meant that I couldn't engage in any illegal activity. The minute this drug is tested, medicalized, and legalized, I'm going to be the first in line waiting to fill my prescription.
You also have, you were a prosecutor, and you have a law degree from Berkeley.
I was a public defender. I was on the other side.
Oh, the other side. I'm sorry.
I have a law degree from Harvard. I was in the same graduating class as President Obama.
Oh, but you taught at Berkeley? You're
yes,
a law professor,
at UC
right?
Berkeley Law School. Yes.
So that's an interesting contradiction too, is that you come from that sort of background.
Yeah, I'm used to lecturing about the law. I'm participating in the legal system, not breaking the law. And so much so, like, I'm the person, I pay my taxes, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't break even those laws. So for me to be willing to commit a crime was a pretty serious situation. But I cannot overstate how depressed I was and how dangerous that was. And, I made the decision that it was better for my children for me to break the law than for me to kill myself. And I didn't see any other way out.
And was writing this book, therefore, easier, and were you more creative as a result of this experiment?
Absolutely. First of all, my depression lifted, and I had those really good days I was looking for. But the unanticipated side effect was that I worked better. I was more creative. I had a greater capacity for focus. I made connections that I might not have made. It really did work as a performance-enhancing drug, even though I was not particularly interested in performance enhancement. I just wanted not to die. But, people take Adderall and Ritalin, which have a lot of side effects and cause irritability, and they take those as performance-enhancing drugs. And it turns out that LSD, at least for me, worked a heck of a lot better.
Is it an aphrodisiac? I don't ask for me. A friend of mine wants to know.
Yeah, for a friend of yours. I am not willing to say that on the radio. Let's just say. It didn't hurt. How about that? Okay. We'll leave it at that.
Well,
so
I
have a reputation for talking about everything. That is not something I'm comfortable talking about.
Well, I know that you have another interview to get to, so I want to let you go so that you can psych up for that one. But thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time, but I think you've gotten certainly to the core of the matter.
Thank you so much.
You have a great day.
It was a great pleasure.
We've been talking today with Ayelet Waldman. Her book is called A Really Good Day, and it is a look at microdosing. Microdosing small amounts of LSD to overcome your depression. And as you heard her say, she isn't taking it continuously. She only took it for about a month to get past this deep depression that had made her at times suicidal. So it was a temporary therapy for a long-term problem, and she thinks of it as a silver bullet. And she believes that we should decriminalize this and make it available to people as a standard therapy for depression because so many people need it. Well, that's a political discussion for others to have. All I'm here to do is to bring you the news, the possibility, the experiment that she ran on herself. And you can decide whether that's a smart thing or whether it's something that should be outlawed for everyone. For Good Books Radio, I've been your host today, Dr. W.F. Strong. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.